Good morning, everybody. We're so glad you came downstairs because we're really excited about our presenter this morning. We will hold a Q&A right after he's done, so be thinking on any questions that you might have that are comments too. So not very many people around that are cradle Episcopalians. This person is a Lana's one. Yeah. Guys went, oh yeah, we've got a little bit of a huddle right up here with it. Grew up in the Episcopal Church. He is an 8 o'clocker. But we were really fortunate when we were Zooming for church to have him be part of it and to get to know him a little bit better. He's been at St. David's for 6 years, 5 or 6 years, yeah. And he's been in the nonprofit arena for a long time. He works as a chief administrative officer at Washburn Center for Children. And he's given a couple of other presentations. He did a really fabulous one a couple years ago on pronouns, part of our diversity and inclusion initiative. So please help me welcome Craig Warren.
Well, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
No.
No? Is that better?
You have to walk with it.
We'll see. I may walk with it. We'll see. Yeah, so I'd like to, thanks for showing up this morning. I'd like to share a little bit about my faith journey. Is that better? I think I can hear the nonverbal. You all are nonverbal communicators. People are like, ear, more. So keep the ear going. I'd like to share a little bit about my faith journey. Basically, as I characterize it in 3 chapters, sort of what I'll call the formation. My time in the wilderness is chapter 2, and then chapter 3 is what I'll call the return to the church. Just to add dramatic flair, like a good biblical story always has some drama and intrigue and mystery in it. There are a couple of themes that I just asked you to consider that as I reflected on this that struck me as I was pulling this together. One of them is I'm a huge Tribe Called Quest fan. I suspect many of you have not heard of Tribe Called Quest, but they're a hip-hop group. But they have a song, and the song is one of my favorite songs. And the song is actually called God Lives Through. And it's one of my favorite songs, not necessarily because of the lyrics, but because that concept of God lives through is something that really resonates with me. And that's something, as I reflected on this, God lives through in a variety of contexts. The other thing that struck me as I was reflecting on this is, which is a part of my faith, a key part of it, is God gives you what you need, not what you want. And that can create crunchiness and challenges in your faith, but I've pretty consistently found God's going to give me what I need, not necessarily what I feel that I want or what I actually want at that point in time. And the other theme that struck me was I went through a Christian spirituality course through the School of Formation, which I highly recommend, though it was a real course. Like, I thought those were going to be like, oh, you just kind of go in, and I forgot. No, there's people who are on the process of being ordained. These are like real courses like you do in seminary, so it was real work. But one of the exercises they had us do was think about and reflect on each week during the, 2 months or whatever of this course, of where do you see God in the events and people that you encounter each day? Which was a really kind of powerful kind of exercise to really be intentional around thinking about that and reflecting on that each week, and really was a great spiritual practice for that. And I realized with that one of the aspects of my journey is that my ability to discern where I'm encountering God in the people and events I incur each day has increased over time, where I'm much more aware of God's presence in my life. And even as I look back, where I wasn't aware, where God was there in the background or in the foreground more than I realized. So chapter 1 is building blocks, kind of my formation. I am not from Minnesota. I was born in New Jersey, and I was fortunate to be born into a Christian family. My father was raised in a Baptist household, and my mother was raised in an Episcopalian household. And they were both raised in the church. Like, they weren't just like my grandparents on both sides were actively involved in their faith communities and made sure their children were raised in that. And that's the world that I came into. Another aspect of that is it's interesting to me when I look back, because during the time when I was growing up was probably a time where religion was on the decline and interest in religion was declining, but I feel like I was in a bubble, that was not at all apparent to me. Because I feel like when I was growing up, the church and religion and faith was everywhere. Like, I was born a couple of years after Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. And it probably wasn't the case in Minnesota, it may not have been the case here, but in black households at that time, like, there would be pictures of Martin Luther King. Like, it was like a family, there'd like be a portrait of this man in the house that you'd think like, well, that's where you put pictures of the family, and there'd be like that. So as a child, you'd like, who is this? Is this a great grandfather? Like, who is this person at a very early age? Because his picture was in like every black household of my grandparents' age would have that. You go into any type of black church, and on the fans, there'd be pictures of Martin. I mean, it was everywhere. So it's like, as a kid, you're like, who is this? Like, who is this? There's Jesus in the church, and then there's this, who is this person? What is this? And that was a very early understanding of, well, that's Martin Luther King Jr. Well, who was he? Well, he was a minister who advocated for civil rights. Well, what's civil rights? Why would we need that? Well, 3-year-old, 4-year-old Craig, here's kind of the U.S. There's some white people who don't like black people. It was part of the law. There was a whole thing, and he advocated for that. So at a very early age, he is a minister, and it was very clear with that narrative, his faith sustained him. Like, literally, his faith sustained him through that, and he was influenced in his nonviolent approach to this by Mahatma Gandhi, who wasn't even a Christian, who had this whole nonviolent thing. So, like, what do you mean he's not a Christian? Because everyone I know is a Christian. He's not a Christian, and this Christian person who had this huge impact, who's revered, his teachings were influenced by someone who another faith leader who wasn't a Christian. Like, how does that work? Where does that come from? And where's India? India had to fight for liberation? Like, so there were all these, I was inquisitive as a child, and I still am inquisitive today, but at a very early age, there were probably these bigger adult things that I had an understanding of the broader world, and there were things happening and what was going on to that. But faith was a part of that. And it was very much in the world. Like, when I was growing up, it was not Catholic, but Catholicism loomed large. I mean, John F. Kennedy had been assassinated a couple years later, the first Catholic president. That was a big deal. The Pope was one of the most well-known. Like, John Paul II was the Pope during a good portion of my childhood, and he was like a rock star celebrity. Like, I remember when he made a visit to I think it was his only visit to the U.S., and that was like covered like the Beatles or somebody was coming from abroad, like, and the Pope Mobile, and he was coming around or whatever. I mean, it was like a big deal. And here's like, oh, there's this faith leader who's a leader of a different faith tradition. He has all these people who are part of his congregation here, and people are very kind of excited about that. In the media, like, I grew up when there was no, like, our first TV was a black and white TV. So like TV becoming, when cable TV and everything happened when I was like a teenager. But I remember you didn't have a whole bunch of options on TV. Like, there was like the main network channels, and there were like the independent UHF channels that you kind of had to tune in with the dial, and there were limited options. So when there was something on TV that was faith-based, which at that time there wasn't a whole bunch of faith-based content, but the people that were noticeable, because it's like, oh, this is like this is a preacher who's on there. And there was like, I think his name was Robert Schuller. He had the Crystal Cathedral or something like that, which is just like I just remember that like that on TV, the majesty or whatever the architecture that was striking. And there's this minister behind like this Fortress of Solitude thing, preaching that was on TV, and people were turning in for that. And the 700 Club, before they had the Christian cable network, the 700 Club would be on, and they would also broadcast like Catholic masses on TV. So, I mean, I was aware of Christianity, and that was that. So I had curiosity. Well, what is this? What are these people talking about? Like, there's people doing church on TV. Like, what is that? Because it wasn't as common as it is now. So religion was very prevalent, as were other faiths. Like, I'm black, and Malcolm X was assassinated shortly before I was born too. And there were things around the difference between, well, there was nonviolent, that was Dr. King, and there was a different path with Malcolm X that he had. Well, he was a Muslim. Well, what's a Muslim? What's the Nation of Islam? What does that look like? That's not Christianity. Well, what is that faith tradition with that? I grew up and down the East Coast, where there was a pretty strong Jewish population wherever I lived. And it was interesting because like in schools, here it's not so much here, I guess for the Lutheran influence or whatever, but there, like there were school holidays because there were Jewish holidays. I mean, there were Christian holidays, but there also were like, this is a Jewish holiday, there's not gonna be school. And you knew other people who were Jewish, and you were aware of that. And you were aware of like people would have their bat mitzvah and bat mitzvah, and you know, Israel was there and things going on with Israel and Palestine. So there was a whole dimension of, well, what is that? And there was a dimension of, well, isn't Christianity sort of like, well, who are the Jews? Where did the Jews come from? Wait, the Jews that are doing all these things now and the Jews from the Holocaust are the same Jews that were like Moses was a Jew, like that, and they were the chosen people and they're still going through all that, like those were the chosen people and they went through all that and they had to go through the Holocaust, like that's the same God? Like how does that work? And Christianity sort of is an offset of Judaism. Like Jesus was a Jew who broke away from mainstream Judaism, but no one talks about that, but it's like a whole separate thing, like it's a separate thing. Like how does that work? So I had questions. I continued to have questions. But those were all around, God was ever present in a variety of different spaces and forms. It wasn't like, oh, there was just one view of this. There were a variety of exposure in the people I interacted with in the broader society in terms of the things I was interacting with. So while this broader decline may have been happening, that wasn't my direct experience. And even more directly, like my mother made sure we went to church. Wherever we, you know, I was born in New Jersey, we moved to Connecticut, Maryland, and Massachusetts, and then came back to New Jersey for high school. So I think I stayed in New Jersey until kindergarten, and basically 1st through 8th, we were living up and down the East Coast, and then we came back to New Jersey, which is where my parents are from, for high school. So there would be a lot of opportunities to find a new faith community because we were moving a lot. And my mother always made sure we found a faith community. And her preference, because she was raised Episcopalian and a predominantly Black Episcopalian congregation, was to find a Black church. But we lived in places where, we were in suburban places where there weren't a whole bunch of Black churches. And this was before the internet. So if you moved somewhere where you didn't know anyone and you want to find a church, you went to the Yellow Pages. And you go to the Yellow Pages and like, what are the Episcopal churches? Okay, Episcopal churches here. All right, how far away do we think that is? All right, let's go check that one out. And this is one of those instances where I became aware of like the saying that one of the most segregated places in America is like 9 a.m. on a Sunday morning. Because there's nothing like being a kid with your mom, where I had 2 siblings, and we all have to go, and we're gonna go visiting church because we moved somewhere. It's an Episcopal church, you know, they have the little, okay, and Yellow Pages Episcopal church, you go, they have the little shield, it's Episcopal, looks like it's still Episcopal church, it's not, hasn't been converted to something else, and you walk in, and it's faces like this. Except it's faces like this that are not welcoming faces. They're faces like this why is this woman here with her 3 Black children, like, this isn't your space. And there's that sort of, you have to be sort of courteous and everything, but there's a thing of we're going through the motions of being hospitable, but we don't really want to be hospitable, and we really prefer that you don't come back again. And I remember multiple instances of that as a child, having and feeling that, not even knowing the dynamic, but knowing like we're not really welcome here, and this isn't, and there's no diversity here, and they don't really want us here, and they're going through the motions. With that, which was interesting to me because that was another question. I'm like, well, if we're all Christians and it's not supposed to matter around race and gender, and you're supposed to be loving everyone and loving your neighbor, that's a weird vibe to have in a congregation that, Mom, you grew up in and that we've been a part of, and we're getting that vibe from that. Like, what's going on? What's that about? And became very aware that even within the Episcopal Church, there are Black Episcopal churches and white Episcopal churches and churches that aspire to be more multiracial. And what the dimensions of that are. So there's diversity even within that can look and feel very different with that. And even though we moved, we would also spend time with our grandparents. And my grandparents on both sides were a big influence in my life, and they were all involved in the church. And my grandfather, on my dad's parents, were Baptist. Have any of you been to Baptist churches? All right, some of you. So Baptist churches and Episcopal churches, putting aside racial differences, very different. And when you layer on top racial differences on top of that, those are like, it's like, that might as well have been like Muslim and Judaism. I mean, those are different, they're very different worlds. But I was blessed to see like, okay, this is both Christian, These are both under the Christian umbrella, arguably both under even the Protestant Christian umbrella. But the experiences, the theology and the experience are very, very, very different. And how people worship and how they express themselves is very, very, very different. A Black Baptist church has a band. Like, it's not just enough to have a choir and just an organ. You have a band, and you have gospel music, and people get up and they get into the Spirit, and the Spirit moves through people. I've never been in an Episcopal church, and I've visited many Episcopal churches, and I've never seen the Spirit take hold of someone in an Episcopal service, like anywhere. Almost every time I've gone to a Baptist service, the Spirit takes through someone. So when you're an usher in a Baptist church, like, they're like nurses, because people have the Spirit move through them, and people are writhing, and then they fall out, and they like pass out, and they need medical assistance, because that service gets you warmed up, and the Spirit goes through you, and it's a very, very, very different experience. And there's not the structure. You show up, you sing songs, the minister, drops knowledge with the sermon, you sing some more songs, announcements, that's it. There is no, we're going to go to the Book of Common Prayer, we're going to open this, we're going to pray this way, we're going to do that. Like, it's a totally different experience. But I had that growing up, because I would go to church with my paternal grandparents, and my grandfather was a deacon in the church, and he taught Sunday school, and I would go with him and go through that. And that was just a very, different experience. And literally, is this the same God? How, they're the same stories. They are the same stories, but this is a very different experience, and the expectations of that are different. Because Baptist is hellfire and brimstone. Baptist churches, when I was growing up, the message was very much around, you're a sinner, by the grace of God, you're saved, you need to do this, you're going to sin, you're going to do sin during the week, we've sinned during the week. Very heavy on that. Not necessarily let's explore and reflect, let's perhaps be supportive, let's be nurturing, or perhaps we're sinning and there's a way God can uplift you to do better, as opposed to being terrified. And there's those very stark contrast of that, which, as a child, I was terrified of God. Because I did not like church. Even I was terrified in the Baptist church, because it's, oh my God, I'm sinning. I haven't even done anything in life yet, and I'm a sinner already, and I'm consigned to hell, and I'm not even grown up yet. And how is this going to work? And how do you get over that? And then the Episcopal church was very structured, and very very formulaic and very sort of academic. It didn't speak to the heart as much, and you sort of went through the motions. And my mother made sure we went. So I got confirmed, I was an altar boy, we did all of the things, and I'm inquisitive. So just going through the motions of stuff has never worked for me in any aspect of my life. So this thing where as long as you're in this household, you are going to go to church, and I'm going to take you, so it's going to be the Episcopal church, and you're going to be actively involved in everything, and you're going to do everything. But I was forced to go through the motions, but it wasn't a source of comfort for me. It wasn't I'm going in and I feel soothed and supported, and this is uplifting. It's Mom's forcing me to go this. We're gonna have to do this. I'm gonna go through the motions. Yes, I believe in God. I'm terrified of God. This isn't supporting me, motivating me to do better. It's terrifying me of everything. And as soon as I don't have to do this, I'm not gonna do this, because I believe in God, but this thing is not supportive. It's a colossal pain. We had to get dressed up for church. There were church clothes where there was no casual. So you had to go to church and get dressed, put on your suit and everything. Then you'd have to come and take off your clothes. So you have to get dressed up. Why am I putting on a suit and tie for an hour and a half? Why can't we just wear whatever clothes with that? So you'd have to get up and do that too. So I was not feeling that. But I was being inculcated, because even though I was still paying attention to stuff, and I was challenging stuff, and I had people who, even though I was a pain, I remember I got an email from one of my Sunday school teachers when I was in high school, and she literally was like, "You were such a pain." Because, and I was yeah, I was. Because I would ask these questions, I'm questioning, I'm a seeker. I'm trying to, how does this make sense? I believe in God, but how the church operates and these things that happen, it's not making sense to me. And that's not what people want. They didn't want someone to challenge and engage in that. They wanted you to be a kid and shut up and do your coloring book and go, just go to the Bible study, go to Sunday school and fill out the blanks and give them own answers. And it wasn't really about let's engage in dialogue. You're clearly a seeker. There's something you're grappling with. How do we kind of address that or bring that within you? Because there's something there. And that wasn't my experience. So when I had the opportunity to go to college, I was I'm out. Like, I believe in God, but I'm not, the church was not like a source of support and comfort for me. It was like, I believe, but I'm not going to be going to church on a regular basis. Like, I'm going to go do my thing and need to figure that out. But the curious thing about that, which I realized, not being in that environment and around that, was that even though I didn't go to church on a regular basis, I was culturally Christian, which I thought was an interesting thing, because you don't really hear people talk about being culturally Christian. You hear people talk about that with Jewish people, where they're like, well, I'm not a practicing Jew, but I'm like culturally Jewish, or I'm ethnically Jewish, and I identify with that. And I know exactly what they're talking about with that, but people don't talk about that with Christianity. And what I realized is, after 18 years of being steeped in Christianity, even though I wasn't going to church on a regular basis and I believed, I was still culturally Christian. So my values and norms and outlook, whether I acknowledged it or owned it or not, was very much aligned with the teachings of Jesus. Like, whether I acknowledged it or not, that was guiding my actions. That was where my value system came from. That's how I wanted to interact with people, and that's how I have and continue to move through life, even though there was a period of time where I went into the wilderness, where I wasn't going to church on a regular basis and didn't have a church home. I was still very much a Christian, and I was very much aware of the fact that, like, oh, I don't have an interest in being a Muslim. And I'm an Episcopalian. Like, I don't want to do the evangelical thing. I don't want to be Baptist. Like, my Christianity is very much through the lens of being an Episcopalian, even though I wasn't going to church on a regular basis. And I had times during that where, even though, I would still go, like, on Christmas Eve, because that was one of the things we did, because I married a woman who was Christian, and like my mother, went to church on a more regular basis. So my wife would still go, and it's like, okay, go on Easter, go on Christmas Eve, on the big holidays, and maybe on Mother's Day, on some other things. And obviously, when I would visit my parents or grandparents, they would still go to church. So I'd still I wasn't totally away from the church, but I just wasn't going on a regular basis. But it reaffirmed for me, it's like, oh, I do believe in God, I am a Christian. There's something there for me to figure out, because I could see where God was working through me in my life, through people, which I think is, and that's how I view really Christianity, is it's not necessarily big miracles, it's people showing up and their own testimony and them doing their ministry in terms of how they live their lives and having an impact. And then you're like, well, why is this person so amazing? How are they so supportive of what's happening? And it's like, oh, it turns out that they're a Christian. That's not, and I look at that's not coincidental. And it was in interesting places and interesting ways. Like, one of the ways that strikes me was I was in the Army. And I was an officer in the Army, and there are not a lot of African American officers in the I was an armor officer with the tanks. So I remember I was doing training at Fort Knox, and there wasn't a whole bunch of diversity, there weren't a whole bunch of other black officers. And I remember there was a chaplain, and the chaplain was Major Pfeiffer. And Major Pfeiffer was an African American chaplain in the Army, which, you want to talk about a rare, like, I didn't fully appreciate, like, how, there's a very small number of chaplains, period, and of African American chaplains, and he looked out for me. And he was an African American person of a more senior rank, and he said, Lieutenant Warren, what's going on? How you doing? I know how things are, I know it can be difficult, and he just sort of checked in on me, which it was a little bit challenging and hard, and to have someone who, even though I wasn't going to church, I still appreciated having a person of faith, sort of, there's a person of faith who's a black person, understands what the deal is, and is reaching out, okay, this is gonna be okay, and there's someone I can rely on and tap into with that. And there were many other instances where there were people like that who sort of were God working through other people to make sure, hey, we're there, we're gonna make sure you're okay, I'm still there for you, I'm gonna make sure you get what you need while you're doing that. And I still kept awareness of the Episcopal Church, because I still was Episcopalian. And I was watching stuff going on in these other congregations. So I was watching the Catholic Church implode as the whole sexual abuse scandal transpired with that. I was watching churches deal with, are we gonna ordain women or not? Are we gonna ordain lesbian people and gay people? Are we gonna ordain transgender people? I watched churches get into politics in terms of, Jesus would have wanted you to do this in this political view. And I was watching the Episcopal Church. And I was watching, it's like, the Episcopal Church is sort of evolving and growing in a way that's aligned with what I think Christian values are, that some of these other congregations are not. So I remember when Barbara Harris was ordained as a bishop, and it's like, oh, there was a black woman who they're making a bishop. That's sort of interesting. Other congregations are not doing that. Apartheid was happening, and I was very much aware of the role that Desmond Tutu, oh, here's another faith leader like Martin Luther King who's fighting against oppression and injustice. Oh, he's an Episcopalian. They have Episcopalians in South Africa. I didn't know. I did not know that. It makes sense, but I did not know that. And here's another black African priest who's an Episcopalian who's fighting for this and putting the good fight in for this. And then Bishop Curry, was elected overall. So I'm like, there's things happening in this church that are aligned with kind of, I think, probably why my mom and grandmother were members of that, that were sort of bubbling up within me. And then I had a point where my grandparents, from like 2012 to 2017, during that 5-year period, over that course of that time, all 4 grandparents passed away, like during that 5-year period. And they were, throughout to the end of their days, they were actively like elders in their church, actively involved in their church. Whenever I'd call my maternal grandmother, she'd always ask, where's the weather? Because we were in cold places. Where's the weather? Are you getting enough to eat? She'd ask about how's my granddaughter doing, and she'd say, when's the last time you went to church? Did you go to church this week? Like throughout my entire, and she'd ask that. There was a significant period of time where it might have been 6 months ago or whatever when I was going to church, but she would always ask that. And my grandfather, whenever I would talk to them, he'd always end the call with, I'm praying for you. Like he would, every time I talked to him, he's just like, I'm praying for you. So I knew that there were people in my life who were religious who were praying for me. Like even if I wasn't there, they were still kind of praying for me and making me aware of that. And my grandmother was pressuring, like, when are you going? I'd really like you to go. But the other grandparents were still praying and were being open about that. So that was always there. So that was sort of like something I took for granted of, well, there's all these people who are very faithful, they're praying for me, that's gonna, that's kind of gonna lift me up. And then they went away. And it was striking, because like my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, when I went off to college, she got me a subscription to Guidepost. I don't know if people know Guidepost. So like I had a gift subscription to buy Guidepost for like 30 years, and I didn't have to do anything. It would come, and I would read it. That was sort of like a little bit like church of, oh, here's another month, here's another Guidepost, here's how God and the Spirit is working through in the world, sort of uplifting and keeping that on the radar. And then like she died, and then the subscription ended. And it was like one of these weird, like I knew she was gone, but it was like one of the things where she's really like, wow, she's gone, because there's like, where's the guy? Like the subscription ended and nobody renewed it, and it wasn't there, and like I had to go out on my own and get the subscription. But that was just one of those like spiritual sort of pillar under the wings things that was there that was gone, and then they all sort of went away, where you could always go to their church and you'd see them, and you go to their church and see their faith tradition, and they talk about that, and they were gone. And I'm like, I have to do this on my own. Like I can't rely on them. Like God has taken them home, and I'm an adult now, like, and I need to create this on my own and go on my own journey with it, so that unleash something within me where I'm like, there's something around this role of faith and spirituality, and I think it involves some type of organized religion and potentially going back to church. So when they passed away, that sort of prompted this sort of discernment on my part. And then I was able to go into this program, which is called the Shannon Leadership Institute, in 2017, which coincidentally I found out about because someone who facilitated that program, I was on a panel and he heard me speak, and he suggested that I go to that, which interestingly enough, he's an ordained minister. So God, once again, working through to take me to this program, which the Shannon Institute was founded by James Shannon, who was a former Catholic priest. And he was a Catholic priest, and one of his parishioners came to him, something around birth control, and he had to counsel her in a way that God compelled him to do, which was not aligned with the teachings of the Catholic Church. So he counseled her in the way that his heart and his faith compelled him to do, and then he had to go to the bishop or whatever and say, I counseled this parishioner in this way, I don't think it can be a priest anymore because it was against the teachings. And he wound up leaving the priesthood. And he had a career, he went into philanthropy. I think he may have run the Minneapolis Foundation, and I think he may have been at the General Mills Foundation. He was in philanthropy, and he got married and left the priesthood. But at some point in his sort of second career, he started the Shannon Institute, because he wanted to create a place for community leaders to sort of understand kind of what their purpose is and to kind of refresh and revitalize by getting in connection with their core values. So it's like this year-long program that's really built around helping you discern. It's in a secular context, but it has spiritual underpinnings. What are your core values, and helping you clarify what those are, and then if those are your core values, what are you called to do? If you're going to bring those values into life, like what are you called to do? Because part of being refreshed and renewed is living your life in accordance with what your values are. And when you don't know what that is, or you're out of sync with that, you're gonna be kind of spiritually out of sync. So I went through that program, and one of the things of my renewal plan was, I need to, because at the end of it you do a renewal plan, and a component of my renewal plan was I need to figure out the role of my faith and spirituality in my life. That's more than just sort of muddling around. I need to be more intentional. And as I thought about that, one of the ways was I need organized religion, because I need the infrastructure and the scale and the people, the resources that come from being in a community, an organized community of faith that can push you, that has support for you, that lets you build relationships with that when you're off on your own, you can read books and do stuff on your own, but it's much easier, in my experience, in a faith community than trying to do that on your own. So then I started, okay, I need to find a church. And I was like, I'm doing the Episcopal Church. I'm not looking at other churches. I need to look at Episcopal churches. So I'm an analytical person. So I created a spreadsheet, and I didn't go on the elevators. I went online and found, okay, I'm in the Twin Cities. Where are all the Episcopal churches in the Twin Cities? And I'm going to start visiting them to figure out where do I want to go and check it out. So I visited like 10 or 15 churches around the Twin Cities, which was interesting because the experience that my mom had with me like 30 or 40 years prior to that, I still had some of that same experience when I would show up. Particularly when I would go to the 8 o'clock services, which that's not really, it's weird, that's not really the service to go to if you're visiting a church, I guess is my counsel. Go to the water service, because there's a fewer number of people at the 8 o'clock, so you're really more likely to stand out there, and it's a lot more awkward when it's not really welcoming and everything like that. It was a learning. But I visited a series of churches, and then there were some that I narrowed down and said, I'm never going back there again, or I'm going to come back here again. And I felt called to St. David's, because when I met, I distinctly remember this, and I think I must have visited 2 times before I decided this is where I'm going to go a couple of times. And Catherine and Guy must have been preaching. I know Lindsay and Lynn preached too, but the 2 times I met, it must have been Guy and Catherine, and their energy was different. Like, there was a different energy to just like, there's a curiosity that Catherine has and a welcoming, and Guy is very welcoming. And I remember one time I was there, Bill Jacobs, I think Bill, I think you were on the vestry or something. I think you were in something, on the vestry or something, or the warden or something, but you made a point, I knew that you were something there, and you made a point of coming over and welcoming him, and people were very, it wasn't like the weird vibe, welcoming. It was like, oh, these people are actually like, they're curious. Like, why are you here? But they're also like curious, like, oh, welcoming, like, we'd love to have you here, which was not a vibe that I consistently felt with that. So that was a factor, and this is like 15 minutes from my house. Well, but that's a big deal for me, because not having gone to church on a regular basis, like, I needed to build the muscle. And if it was going to be like a heavy lift, like, oh yeah, I'm going to drive an hour, and then when it's snowy or rain, or wet or whatever, it's like, there's a good chance I'm not going to go. 15 minutes away, straight up 494. There's not a whole bunch of excuses. Even when it snows, I probably can get up here. It might take 20 minutes. It's doable to get back into that. So there was a practical factor in addition to the spiritual factor, but that's what led me here. And I also was challenged, because I was thinking, as I was discerning around what role does faith and spirituality have, there was a question of, is the ministry or being ordained in my path? Is that part of my path? And I had this thing of, well, if I'm going to do that in the Episcopal Church, for what I want to create and what I view as a Christian, that's probably would be with a white congregation or a multiracial congregation. It's not going to be with a black congregation, because that's not the type of world I want to create through Christ. So this would be a challenge for me to go to a congregation that doesn't have a lot of black people, isn't particularly diverse, because if I'm really going to go into ministry and do that, I need to be ready to do it all in on that, because you don't know where God's going to send you or where you're going to be called. So you better figure out early on, like, what that's going to be like, which that's not a thing anymore. I think I've discerned that's not a path, but that still is something that matters to me in terms of Christianity, that some of the symbols and the racism and everything that's embedded in that that's not what Jesus was really about. And we have to remove sort of some aspects of our current cultural context. We need to adapt and modify. There are other aspects of that we need to toss out so we can go back to the things that are really relevant with that. And I continue to be challenged. I thought this is going to challenge me to grow spiritually around loving your neighbor, indifference, and when people are not the same to really do that, which it has. So that leads us to today. So that's kind of what led me from my foundational years up to what brought me to St. David's.
So we do have time for some questions. So who has the first question? Or comment? Yes.
So I'm really glad at the end you got to why you stayed, because of people like Bill, and hopefully people came to you and welcomed you. I'm so glad for that. How, and I hesitate to ask this because I hear when we're talking about racial justice and all that, don't call him the only black person in the room to speak for all black people, right? But you
I am the only black person. I don't know if I can speak for all black people, but I am the only black person.
So my question is, how can we attract more black people to come? How can we bring more people like you to say, we actually really want you here, we want you to feel welcome?
I think you have to be intentional on whether you want to be multiracial or not, honestly. Because the church, for a lot of reasons, which I don't think we need to go into here, churches are segregated. And the churches that aren't segregated, that are intentional or not, there's reasons why they're intentionally breaking the general trend of churches being segregated. So if you want to be a multiracial, multicultural congregation, I think that takes intentional work that's what you aspire to do. And there's different things you need to do in terms of your outreach, in terms of your liturgy, in terms of how you're approaching that are different than just we just want to be a church. Because multiracial congregations take, my wife is part of one of those, like they take work. That's just a different animal to shift from being something like we're predominantly white and we want to move towards that, or to be more welcoming of that. And I think it's more than like I literally think you have to be intentional around what are the aspects of your culture that do that, how are you going to market? I think you have to market yourself for that, because if you're a neighborhood church, which St. David's is somewhat driven by, it's not neighborhood, but it's people with a certain geography. And if you're going to do that, and that's not diverse, you're going to have trouble becoming a multiracial congregation. So I think if you want to do that, there's certain strategic things in terms of, I think, what the church wants to be that you need to figure out and then align resources against that.
Who's got the next question? Comment?
I have one. So I really liked your thoughts around coming here to intentionally participate in with a community that was not like you, to discover what is who you are and where you want to go with your faith. I really love that. And I really wonder why we're not all doing that intentionally all the time. Because I came from downtown Minneapolis and I thought this was not a diverse enough church for me. And when I first walked in, my parents have been here though, so I had that, but I really felt uncomfortable, with a suburban church. And I really love the idea of finding what's different and same in no matter what community we're in. And that, to me, should be part of what our intention is as a community. I just wanted to say that. Thank you for that. And for giving us a chance. That's amazing.
Greg, will you call us out? Would you be willing, because I don't think any one of us in here feels like, geez, we're just talking the talk, we don't really want a diverse culture. I think that we really want it, I do, but I think you're right, we're not being super intentional about it. We're kind of wishing, I wish that would happen, but what can we do? But are you comfortable ever, or do you, maybe I shouldn't be asking this question, but if, we just went through International Women's, it's International Women's Week at my job, right? And we as a leadership team got together and we said, you know what? We are gonna call each other out. And we have done that. If men are talking over women in a meeting, we're raising our hand and going, hey, she was talking. And it's uncomfortable and it's weird. but maybe it's not fair for me to ask you that question. You could be honest, but will you call us out, or have you, or are you willing to do that?
I think I prefer calling people in.
Okay.
Because I think calling people out is shaming.
Okay.
Whether intentionally or unintentionally, the impact, I don't care about intentions, I care about impact. And the impact of calling people out is shame and guilt a lot of the time. And I'd rather call people into, are we aligned in terms of what we want to create? And are we giving each other constructive feedback and pushing each other to do something that's challenging and create that we're all moving towards the same thing, and we're going to have tough conversations and change how we do it, but we're all aligned in terms of being called in, and we're suspending some of the judgment and allowing that we all have room to grow more than calling out. So I think, Catherine and others could say, I feel like I may have called out. I may have done some calling out, but I feel like more about calling in, and we have to decide, like, there's nothing wrong. There's nothing inherently wrong with being a predominantly white congregation. There's a lot of congregations that are like that. Like, someone has to choose. You choose who you are and what you want to be, and it's up to you to live with, is that what we want to be or not what we want to be. I don't know that there's anything wrong or right with that, because everyone's not equipped and able to be something different than that. There's nothing worse than trying to say you're trying to do something that you're never ever going to be. I'd rather you be like, this is what we are, and we know what we are, we know what the consequences of that are, and we're comfortable living with that, and this is where we're going to grow, as opposed to picking an aspirational thing that isn't really what you're ever going to be capable of doing, that's not aligned with who you are. Like, I feel like organizations and people, you should be who you are and own and understand what that means, but you shouldn't try to be something that you're not.
Other thoughts? Yeah, Catherine.
I have a question. I'm curious about your involvement with Ecmn, and can you talk a little bit about that?
Okay. So I think it was in October, because like I've been back in the church for whatever since I came back. So there's a lot of things that are very familiar, because I spent 18 years in it, and the church hasn't changed that much. And there's other things that I was never, as a child, like I didn't care about how people became priests or how it ran or the vestry. Like, I didn't care about that. But in my day job, like I'm a nonprofit executive, so I have curiosity of where's the intersection of my professional experiences with kind of my spiritual life. So there was this opportunity that was afforded me to, I guess you run for the standing, I guess it's elected, I guess you run. I guess I ran for the standing committee, and I was elected to that in October. So I don't know, I did not know what the standing committee was or that it existed until someone suggested that I look into that. So the standing committee is made up of lay people and clergy, and we provide counsel to the bishop. And if there is no bishop, we actually are the ecclesiastical authority for the diocese. If the bishop is incapacitated, there isn't a bishop. So when there's a search committee, you need a bishop. The standing committee plays a big role in terms of identifying that and running the search process. We also have to approve any real estate transactions with any for any congregation in Minnesota. Like, if you're going to sell property, or you're going to expand property, or you're going to buy it, that has to be approved by the standing committee. And also, if you're going to be a candidate to be ordained, we have to sign off on that. So we make a recommendation. We meet with all the people who are, I'm going to get postulants, or basically before you become a candidate, to get to that stage of candidate, we meet with all the people and make a recommendation to the bishop on whether that person should move forward and actually become a candidate to be ordained. So there's a combination of, I think there's 12 of us. I think it's six lay people and 6 clergy from across the state who serve on the standing committee. And I'm doing it because I thought it's sort of like a nonprofit board, and that's work that I do, but it's totally not like a nonprofit board. I'm finding it in other areas. And I thought it was just another way for my professional experiences to go into my personal ministry in a way that some other things don't. And it's, yeah, I'm finding it fascinating, because that's a whole nother world that I had no visibility to. I'm like, oh, this is how you become a priest. Why do we have to like sign off on this? It's fascinating. So I recommend that for all. There's other like bodies that you can, I know there's a missionary council and those things, but it's really fascinating to understand how the church works on a different level than what happens within kind of your congregation, because it's very different.
One final question? I
final comment?
I have one.
Yes.
How's your daughter? I know she's come a couple times with you.
Yep.
And do you have what else? One daughter?
We have one daughter. Yeah, my wife and I have one daughter who's a senior in high school. So
Does she
this is,
ask a lot of questions too?
Good one.
she does, but she's smoother than her dad. She's not very inquisitive, but she's not as direct and she's much more diplomatic than I am. But this is a big week because we're waiting. She's a senior, so this is regular decision week during the course. So hopefully by Friday we'll hear from all the schools, and then we'll be going through figuring out where does she get in and where does she go.
Wow.
So that's bittersweet. Exciting for her, sad, a little sad for us.
Let's thank everyone.
So, fabulous. It was great to have you here and to hear your story, and we're glad you're with us. So come to 9:30 once in a while. Also, next week we'll be hearing from Anna Brock, and she'll tell her story, and then we have Lana next, right? And Gervais.
Survey them, Lana.
Yeah, Gervais and then Lana. So stay with us, and we'll see you next week.